Hello, and welcome back to Specimen the Sociologist. This is your host, Jessamyn Reichman. If you couldn't tell from the name of the podcast, I have a very corny way of introducing myself, and that is my name, Jessamyn, rhymes with specimen, but with a J. I am a budding sociologist who is radically in love with people, and now that love has sent me on a quest to figure out how can science be used as a tool to stabilize our social interactions. Today's episode is going to look a wee bit different. I'm introducing a new segment called Principles in a Pod, and I got this idea from Peas in a Pod. One day I thought to myself, if peas serve as a substance of pods, how can principles serve as a substance of this podcast? While yes, science is important, it's even more important that we remain sensible to the information that we consume and how we store that information to relate to one another. I believe that principles serve as a moral compass to how we have conversations. So without further ado, let's dive into today's first principle, and that being forgiveness. The reason why I chose forgiveness as the first principle to discuss is because it has challenged my ability to be generous. As a person who is known for sowing financially or pouring into other people in the form of encouragement or even serving on a team, I realize that unless I'm able to give the gift of forgiveness to another person, how generous can I actually be? And how far can I actually grow in my personal development? With that being said, let's dive into the textbook definition of forgiveness and let's talk about it. The American Psychological Association would define forgiveness as the following. It is the willing act of being able to put aside feelings of resentment towards someone who has committed a wrong, been unfair, hurtful, or otherwise harmed you in some way. Forgiveness is not merely accepting what happened or ceasing to be angry. Rather, it involves a voluntary transformation of your feelings, attitudes, and behavior so that you are no longer dominated by resentment and can express compassion, generosity, or the like toward the person who wronged you. My favorite part of that definition is that it talks about how forgiveness, one, is a social act, but two, how forgiveness is embedded in our behavior. It's not just our emotions, it's not just our attitudes, but it physically is how we engage with ourselves and with those around us. And so the best place to start, I would say, for this podcast would be to identify the ways that unforgiveness can show up. And I'll start with myself. As I had mentioned earlier, I took on just a deeper revelation of what forgiveness means in the season, and that being connected to generosity, my ability to give forgiveness as a gift to those around me, but also to myself. The ways that unforgiveness presented itself in my personal life came about in three simple ways. The first was the way that I had conversations with other people. If I was constantly referencing the past, or if I was bringing nothing new to the conversation, that was a moment in time I'm like, you know what, Jessamyn Reichman, you have not forgiven that person. Number two is taking past pain from one relationship and projecting it onto another one. That could be seen as assuming rather than asking how a person is showing up. The last part would be in my inability to actively listen. At times when I was talking to a person that I had feelings of resentment towards, I'd only listen to the parts that I needed to hear to either move forward with my day or with the assignment. Now I realized later on that when I actively forgave that person, I no longer listened through the filter of offense, but I was far more curious to hear about their day, how they thought about things, and I learned that I too could be generous with a listening ear. Now, this is a perfect transition. I just discussed 3 simple ways that unforgiveness was embedded into my social behavior and pattern. Now, I would love for you to stop, pause, and ask yourself the same questions. What are ways that unforgiveness is subtly embedded in your day to day? Now, this may mean that you have to reflect on that one heartbreak, or that past friendship failure, or that one tough conversation that you had with a parent. Did you take on any patterns from that moment? And are those patterns still present today? Anywho, moving along, let's talk about what forgiveness actually entails and how does this specimen understand it as a social act. The first point is this: forgiveness is final. Once you have made the decision to forgive a person, you are no longer able to bring up past behaviors or receipts. The second point would be forgiveness allows you to be present. By no longer bringing up those past behaviors, you're able to fully process the current conversation or circumstance. And I realize that forgiveness is an opportunity for a person to not only be seen, but to be heard. Which leads to the third point. Forgiveness gives the other person the gift of assuming responsibility. It's important to identify the root cause of our decision making and to take responsibility for our actions. If we view forgiveness as a social act, then it's the first step to empowering another person to become a healthier version of themselves by developing self-awareness and self-control. The next point is forgiveness is unmerited. And I'm actually going to use an example to break this point down. Recently, I FaceTimed an old friend from college, and I had mentioned that the best gift I can give a person is a disciplined me. When I make a mistake in a relationship, chocolate and compliments are not going to help. Rather, I can take note of the area that I'm weak in and ask myself, how can I be more disciplined in this area, or how can I ask for help? Which goes to the next point. Forgiveness without grace is glorified tolerance. If we view forgiveness as a social act, it's very unfair to expect a person to change overnight. And I found that grace is the best tool for me to continue to show up and to grow and to, again, become the best disciplined version of myself. Now, this leads me to my last point, which is also my favorite point. Forgiveness cannot exist without generosity. The reality is, we're all human and we all fall short. And if we realize that forgiveness is a social act that empowers us to become disciplined, to be more self-aware, to give grace to those around us, then we have to realize that to be offended by another person is the inevitable. And I realized that if I can be generous with forgiveness, I will always be able to move forward. I will always be able to encourage those around me, and that I'll always be able to be as present as possible. So that's why I realized that forgiveness is a tool for transformation, because it allows you to show up every day as if it's a brand new day, as if it's day one. And there's no greater gift than that. And on that note, we are at the end of today's episode. Hopefully, you enjoyed learning more about forgiveness, and I look forward to discussing more principles in the future. But before I let you go, I have a few resources that I believe can complement today's topic. The first resource is actually one of my favorite podcasts, and it's called The Psychology of Your 20s. The host, Jemma Sbeg, has a special episode called The Psychology of Forgiveness. In this episode, she dives into what psychologists have to offer about forgiveness and why it is a life-changing philosophy that we all need. So whether you are in your 20s, approaching your 20s, or need to revisit your 20s, this podcast is perfect for every person. You can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and iHeartRadio. The second resource may be a stretch, but hear me out. It's a song called Cherry by one of my favorite musical groups, Jungle. The main chorus goes, "You're never gonna change me, I was already changing." Now, while I spoke about forgiveness in the context of interpersonal relationships, I want to highlight the most important relationship, and that being the one that you have with yourself. In moments where I need to forgive myself, I listen to the song and it reminds me that I'm always changing, I'm always moving forward, and how that is a beautiful thing. And the last resource is a sermon by Lysa TerKerust titled Forgiving What You Cannot Forget. And while she had a lot of takeaways, my favorite one was actually a question that she posed. And it was, can you forgive before the offense occurs? And what I love about the nature of that question is it suggests, again, that forgiveness is a social act. And it is a tool that allows us each independently to move forward. So, I think that's about it for today's episode. Until next time, have a powerful day.